Hello, how are you all doing? I'm Lucas Kanga, and in today's class we're going to cover a very interesting topic that has to do with memory and its relationship with value models. In fact, understanding that one of our cognitive abilities studied by cognitive neuroscience is memory. Memory allows us to be who we are, and for that to endure over time. Remembering in order to know is one of the main cognitive functions of human beings. But actually, just imagine if we didn't know ourselves based on what we value. And that's why we're first going to define what a value is. A value is a conception, a basic concept, but one that is learned. It's not innate, it's not inherited, rather we learn it from our environment, at home, through our religion, at school, in our relationships, in our countries. To say that different countries have different values is absolutely true. And that's why we value and decide what we want based on what we've learned. That's why these values, depending on whether they were learned more acutely, in other words, over shorter periods, will differ from those we learned in a much more chronic or much longer term way. So, where is all of this stored? What does memory have to do with this? To relate memory to values, we first need to explain the three main types of long-term memory. In reality, humans have short-term memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory, which is called working memory, is what allows me, for example, to remember all the elements I need, about 7 plus or minus 2 concepts, that I require to function in the present. Let's set that memory aside and focus a little on long-term memory. Long-term memory is the way I store the forms of my being, of who I am, what I value, what I know, the language I speak, and the society I belong to. And that long-term memory has two forms. One is implicit, and the other is explicit. Let's not get tangled up with words. Let's just think that there's an explicit memory that I am aware of. I know how to speak my language, I know where I live, I know how to name the words that are part of my vocabulary. That's why it's called semantic memory. Semantic memory is a type of memory where I know where I learned it. That's where all the meanings and signifiers are kept. What words do I use? What does a value mean to me? What do I value? So there, in semantic memory, which is completely explicit, I know what I value, I know what I have learned. I know why I value it. That's where we'll find the tables or scales of values. We'll go into a bit more detail about that later, but for now let's describe the second type of explicit memory, which is what's called episodic memory. If we already have all our meanings in semantics, we need to know where we acquired them. So for example, I remember that today, before recording, I came in through the street. I entered a certain place, I parked my vehicle in a particular spot. If we don't have episodes, then it's very difficult to fill semantic memory. One might say that the more episodes I have, the more I can fill my semantic memory. This is a highly explicit memory where I obtain it consciously. But we also have, as we mentioned, a third type of memory. This third type of memory, which, although it is long-term, is absolutely implicit, or we could say unconscious, is the way we act automatically. This memory is called procedural memory. It would be complicated if I asked you how you managed to drive. If you had to tell me how to drive, you would have to describe and detail every single action you need to perform in order to drive. How much force, how many centimeters, how you have to position the gear stick, which way you need to turn, at what angle. It would be absolutely cumbersome. That's why there are loads of areas of our cognition that we put on autopilot. Where are they stored? In procedural memory. There we have everything from turning on a computer without even looking at the password we're entering, to, for example, playing our favourite sport, which we now do from memory, or walking into our house and knowing it's our house, even if the lights are off. So now it's time to understand how values are related to memory. Values, which are these basic learned concepts that can shape the way I am and how I decide what I want and what I don't want, or how I behave or don't behave, must be stored somewhere, and they're stored in long-term semantic memory. Let's define two types of values, two groups of values, which are stored in different ways. One group is terminal values. Terminal values are values that required a lot of time, a very long-term process to acquire them. You can see them, for example, in societies, in countries, in religions, or for instance in universities or schools. I spent a long time under the same value influence, and that's why I acquire it and keep it recorded as a meaning that I find valuable. That'll make me prefer relationships with people who went to my university, or who live in my country, or possibly make me not want to work with people who perhaps are not from my country. These values are called terminal values and are strongly lodged in semantic memory. That is why it's said that it is a value that is very difficult to change. It is an end in itself in life. They're life goals that we have. For example, we can find there freedom, true friendship, the value of pride in one's country, or caring for my family. If you notice, and I were to ask you which of these you would be willing to give up, it wouldn't be an easy question to answer. But that's also why we have another level of memory, and at that level we have what are called instrumental values. Values that are much sharper, acquired in a more acute way, for short periods of time, and which are absolutely situational. For example, responsibility. One might say, are you responsible? Always? Are you always ambitious? Are you always organised? If you notice, one could quite easily sometimes not use those values, and that's why they are stored at different levels of memory. Understanding memory systems and their relationship with values can help me understand why it's sometimes difficult to differentiate leadership styles, and to see that different leadership styles can have different values. And also that exercising leadership is not always easy, because I have to lead organisations that also have terminal and instrumental values, as well as people who also have terminal or instrumental values. To sum up today's class, we have a major topic, which is memory, that cognitive ability that makes us human, that allows us to remember who we are, what we want, and what we don't want. And it's clear that this memory must be properly incorporated, and we see this in two ways. One is a more chronic form, which gives us rise to terminal values, which are acquired in a much more chronic, longer-term way, in countries, situations, schools, universities, spending a lot of time under that value-based influence. But there are also those values that come from a much shorter, more acute impact, such as instrumental values. Understanding my values is the foundation for also being able to understand my identity and my connectome. Because based on my values, I choose certain situations and distance myself from others, which means I am constantly loading my mental models and my connectomes to become who I am. This ability, memory and values, is one of the capacities that sets us apart from animals. Thank you for taking part in this class, and I'll see you in the next session.